Have you really given consideration to what might have happened to aircraft with Instagram stars? Their flashy flight just went dark right after takeoff within minutes. The NTSB has pointed to the likely cause of the crash. But is that the whole story? Where did the chain of errors actually begin? And most importantly, what reckless error did the pilot make, aside from the technical problems with the plane? Let's take a closer look at the details we have so far. The story unfolds in Scottsdale, Arizona during the early evening hours. A Piper Comanche aircraft, carrying several passengers, tragically crashed and was completely destroyed just 70 seconds after takeoff. Among the passengers was 23-year-old Instagram model Mariah Coogan, who had posted a video as she boarded the plane. In the video, Mariah can be seen seated in the middle row next to 28-year-old Anand Patel, a successful entrepreneur and social media influencer known by his nickname, Happy. Anand had shared a photo before the flight, eager for what seemed to be his first experience on a private aircraft. In the back of the plane sat 22-year-old Helena Logos, a part-time fashion model from Las Vegas, and 23-year-old Iris Rodriguez, a visitor from Honduras. Maria's video also captured the two pilots in the cockpit. However, there are two key details to note. First, the video appears reversed due to the way Maria filmed it, so this is how it should actually look. Secondly, and most critically, only one of these men is a certified pilot. What's inside the cockpit? In the right seat of the aircraft sat 32-year-old Eric Valente, the only certified pilot on board. Eric held an airline transport pilot certificate and was a certified flight instructor with around 5,200 hours of total flight experience. However, he had logged just 200 hours flying Piper Comanches. In fact, the first time he flew the accident aircraft was when he piloted it from North Las Vegas to Scottsdale to pick up the student pilot. His employer, the chief pilot at the company, praised Eric as an exceptional aviator, saying he would be dearly missed. More details about Eric will come later. On the left seat for the flight was 28-year-old James Pedroza, a student pilot. James made a message on Instagram, expressing his pride in the fact that he had managed to acquire the aircraft just 2 months prior to the fatal accident. In point of fact, however, he had only purchased a fractional share, which is an important distinction that will be explained in further detail. Despite the fact that James was a passionate traveler, he was still a newbie in the world of aviation because he was a student pilot who had just recently begun his training. This vacation that ended as a disaster was planned by James. A truth that is extremely important to keep in mind is that student pilots are not permitted to take on the role of the pilot in command of an aircraft that is transporting people. The implication of this is that James ought to have been sitting in the right seat, and Eric ought to have been situated in the left seat. It was not intended for the flight to serve as a learning experience. This was the first of many irresponsible choices that ultimately led to this tragic event that broke everyone's hearts into pieces. The holes in Swiss cheese. Similar to the holes in the Swiss cheese model, it's important to understand how different contributing elements aligned to determine the full scope of what led to this calamity. The secret to this is knowing how James and Eric came to fly together. The jet was not truly James's to own. Rather, he had acquired a small stake in it from his friend Josh. But Mr. B, as we shall call him, was the true owner of the airplane. James planned to take his pals to Las Vegas, where he was employed as a VIP host at the Mirage nightclub, but he was in Scottsdale at the time. The plane was at the airfield in North Las Vegas, and James needed a pilot to take it to Scottsdale so they could be picked up. That was the only problem. James had originally intended for his former flight instructor to lead the trip, but that arrangement fell through. James tried to get in touch with Josh, but Josh was also unreachable. Josh then made the connection between James and Eric Valente to operate the plane. Eric informed Josh that this would not be an instructional flight, after discovering that James was a student pilot because he had not even finished any ground training with James. This is an important point to keep in mind, especially since James, the student pilot, was situated in the left seat and Eric was in the right. The missed red flags. One crucial detail that almost prevented this flight was the fact that the plane's owner, Mr. B, had only met Eric on the day of the accident. Upon meeting him, Mr. B was unsure about allowing Eric to take the aircraft, even questioning who he was. After some hesitation, however, he eventually agreed to let Eric proceed. What's even more shocking is that Mr. B had no idea James planned to bring 4 passengers along for the trip. If he had known this, there's a strong possibility he wouldn't have allowed the flight to take place at all. The condition of the aircraft. The aircraft in question was a 1964 Piper PA-24-260 Comanche with the tail number November 9456 Papa. The student pilot James posted a video of the airplane that shows how little it is. Even though this aircraft is advertised as having 6 seats, most seasoned pilots wouldn't consider flying with more than 4 persons, particularly if they had luggage. They might, at most, let a tiny child or pet ride in the rear. Later on, the owner acknowledged that the final 2 chairs were little more than loose seat cushions on the ground. 2 people were seated in the aft section without sufficient seat construction. It is noteworthy to emphasize that boarding an airplane without securely fastened seats needs to raise an alarm right away. A plane is not always designed to carry 6 persons safely just because it has 6 seats. Even though it was a serious worry, there were other problems with this flight. The pilots believed the aircraft to be airworthy since there were no known mechanical issues at the time of departure. Actually, this plane had completed all of its prior missions safely. The pre-flight situation. A witness at the airfield stated that James showed up with his 4 friends while they were waiting for Eric to arrive with the plane. The witness heard James indicate that he needed a few more flight hours to be able to fly solo when they were hanging out. The witness did not raise any concerns, although she did express amazement that all 5 of them planned to fit into the little airplane. The witness saw that Eric appeared agitated as he approached the lobby during the boarding procedure after he arrived with the airplane. Still, he remained silent at the moment. It's crucial to keep in mind that Eric had explicitly stated that this would not be an instructional flight, which probably meant that he had taken off from Scottsdale with the expectation that James would take the right seat on the way back to Las Vegas. There are 2 possible explanations for Eric's seeming unease. Firstly, it's probable that Eric was unaware that James was traveling with 4 passengers, just like the owner of the aircraft. He may not have expected this. Second, James might have asked Eric if he could pilot the plane from the left seat in order to impress his pals. Being a seasoned pilot, Eric would have understood that James wasn't supposed to be in the left seat on this particular flight because he was a trainee. There isn't a really compelling reason why James would wind up there. Sadly, it's unknown why James ended up in the left seat, and the NTSB was unable to establish who was in charge at the time of the crash or during takeoff. Still, it's simple to understand how Eric would have found himself in a challenging situation. He might have been hesitant to decline the flight since he was holding an offer to become a teacher and he didn't want to risk losing his job. This tragedy has taught pilots, especially instructors, that it is crucial to establish ground rules before accepting a flight partner or employment offer. Saying no or leaving a situation that doesn't seem right are sometimes required. In this instance, Eric was seated correctly, and they took off shortly after. The takeoff and fatal crash. The flight was given the all-clear to taxi to runway 03, which is more than 8,000 feet long. The control tower is located close to the middle of the runway. The NTSB recreated the takeoff and catastrophic crash scenario, which lasted for barely 70 seconds, using video from multiple airfield cameras. Wings shaking from side to side were detected by the tower controller shortly after the aircraft took off. Similar observations were made by another witness on the ground, who described the plane's nose bouncing sharply up and down. The plane was moving so violently that it nearly felt like the pilot was doing this irregular flying on purpose. But after a little while, the plane seemed to steady and went by the control tower, which is halfway down the runway with its wings level. The controller noted that the engine didn't seem to be putting out enough power in spite of this. Near the end of the runway, the aircraft started a left-hand turn while maintaining its course. The airplane kept turning until it abruptly plummeted into a nose-down position, which resulted in a disastrous crash. The airplane may be seen approaching the frame from the upper right and making its catastrophic left-hand turn in the traffic camera footage of this tragic episode. It's crucial to remember that although this footage is helpful for the inquiry, some viewers might find it upsetting. What went wrong? What exactly led to this tragic crash? First, witness testimony confirms it was Eric who communicated with the tower, stating, "We're good, we're just a training lesson." This suggests it's possible that James, the student pilot, was handling the takeoff. Although the aircraft was struggling to gain altitude, Eric might have assumed this difficulty was due to James flying, rather than an issue with the aircraft itself. At the time of the takeoff, the temperature was 28 Natani, 82 degrees, and given the airfield's elevation of around 1,500 feet, the density altitude was approximately 3,000 feet. According to the NTSB, under these conditions and at maximum gross weight, the aircraft should have been capable of climbing at a rate of 700 feet per minute. But here's what actually happened. The blue line on the provided chart shows the aircraft's altitude during the flight. The data starts when the plane was already 59 feet above the ground, because earlier footage was washed out, forcing the NTSB to approximate what occurred before that point. They concluded that the takeoff roll began about 45 seconds prior to the first data point, and that the aircraft became airborne 18 seconds before the data began. This means it took 18 seconds to climb just 59 feet, and from there, it continued to climb at a mere 270 feet per minute for the next 27 seconds before essentially stalling in its ascent. The important lesson is that provided there is enough runway ahead, it is imperative to abort if an aircraft isn't operating as planned during takeoff. Eric ought to have given this some thought in this instance. He permitted the student to sit in the left seat, even though it was only his second flight in this specific aircraft. Besides, they were flying a fully laden jet at night at an airfield that Eric had probably never been to before. These elements ought to have inspired greater prudence. Using the entire runway when it is available is another crucial reminder. In one instance, the aircraft reached a height of barely 59 feet in 18 seconds, yet there was still almost 4,000 feet of runway left. It would have been simple for them to put the plane down again and evaluate the circumstances. The tower controller even questioned if there was a problem, but Eric answered that it was just a training flight, so they went on, despite the aircraft performing poorly on the climb. The airplane stalled as soon as it passed the critical angle of attack during its left-hand turn. Sadly, it went down on the edge of a golf field nearby. The NTSB's final findings. The NTSB's investigation revealed that one of the contributing factors to the tragic crash was a malfunction in the number 3 engine cylinder valve spring. The spring had broken into 4 separate pieces, and while an examination of the other 5 cylinders showed no issues, the failure of this spring had a significant impact. It caused a reduction in engine power output, which in turn degraded the aircraft's ability to climb effectively. The investigation could not determine exactly when the spring had failed, but concluded that it occurred during a prior flight. While this failure reduced the aircraft's performance, it was not considered the root cause of the disaster. One critical detail from the investigation was tied to James's purchase of a fractional interest in the aircraft from his friend Josh, which allowed him to use the plane on the day of the accident. Josh, seemingly concerned about the flight's safety, had a premonition and texted James, expressing worries about the number of passengers and the weight on board. Josh's message was clear. "Make sure you guys aren't overweight or anything. Eric is by the book." Sadly, James lacked the knowledge necessary to determine weight and balance correctly. James replied by stating that only 5 of the 6 individuals weighed a total of 675 pounds, including roughly 10 pounds of luggage. In an attempt to evaluate the circumstances, Josh inquired about the gross weight of the aircraft. James accurately replied that the useful load, or the total weight the aircraft could safely carry, including passengers, luggage, fuel, and oil, was 1,200 pounds. Josh's worry ought to have raised a serious red signal, but after the conversation, he decided they were within reason. Additionally, he advised James to discuss the figures with the instructor, Eric. This discussion reveals yet another overlooked possibility, another flaw in the Swiss cheese concept. James most certainly never talked to Eric about these specifics, and Eric, regrettably, may not have performed an accurate weight and balance computation either. Tragically, the 6 passengers' actual aggregate weight was closer to 950 pounds, which was 135 pounds more than the aircraft's maximum gross weight. Additionally, the center of gravity was pushed past the safe limit by more than 2 inches. It's likely that Josh still feels guilty for not doing more to stop the flight. Despite being significant, the damaged cylinder spring had not been noticed on earlier flights since they were not carried out close to maximum gross weight. However, the engine strain became apparent on this specific flight since there were 6 passengers. The situation might have been less dire, and the flight might have been saved if the spring had not failed. Nevertheless, the other careless choices made that day, like failing to perform a correct weight and balance calculation, are not justified by the broken spring. Toxicology testing made matters worse by detecting traces of cocaine and ecstasy in James's urine and blood. But because the quantity was so small and cocaine has a short half-life, the NTSB came to the conclusion that drug use was not a factor in the tragedy. Ultimately, the NTSB concluded that the aircraft's overloading contributed to the instructor's inability to maintain control of the aircraft during the climb, which was the most likely cause of the disaster. But Eric's choice to let James, a novice student pilot, assume the left seat during the flight is probably another significant problem. It's possible that Eric was under pressure, in a difficult circumstance, and reluctant to say no. However, things may have turned out differently if he had performed a weight and balance check and declined the trip on the grounds that he was too heavy, or if he had insisted on taking the left seat. Because of his experience, Eric might have been able to decide to abandon the takeoff after noticing the aircraft's subpar performance early on. Regretfully, we can never be certain. This was a preventable catastrophe that claimed 6 lives. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.